If you have a Bible, open it up to Matthew chapter 3. That's going to be where we start. Before Easter, we were in a series called What Happened Next, and I'm kind of just sticking with that title. I had several stories and people in the Bible I wanted to highlight throughout this series, and so it's not necessarily going to stick in chronological order, but we're still going to look at some things that happened in their lives and what happened next. And so we're in Matthew chapter 3, and today we're going to be talking about the life of Jesus a little bit during this entire message, actually. And so the way this part of the passage picks up, and I'm going to turn over there myself here, is that Jesus is about to begin his public ministry. This is kind of the time in his life when he's going to reveal who he is for a few short years on this earth. And he's going to do that through miracles that he performs. He's going to do it through teaching that he teaches people and travel around to different regions and just tell everybody that comes his way. And so he starts with a group of people here, what are called his disciples. And he starts with 12 of them, and he pours into their life. He teaches them the way to live from his perspective. And he shows them, he doesn't just say it, he shows them how to do it. And then he empowers them to do it themselves. And so in this part of the story, though, this is right in the beginning. And Jesus does something interesting. Most of Jesus' life is an example, well, all of it is, but as we read it, we see the purpose of why he does so many things is an example for us to follow. There's certain things that only Jesus can do. For instance, the way that we get saved, our forgiveness of sins, him dying on the cross and raising from the dead by his own power. That's going to be reserved for him, We're not going to be able to pull that one off. However, the rest of his life and the things that he does and the teachings that he teaches, those are all things that we can do and participate in and also continue on throughout the generations. And so this is what's going on here in Matthew chapter 3. He comes to this place to get baptized. I had a baptism class before church, and we're going to have another one on Wednesday at 6 p.m. here. So if anybody was wanting to get water baptized in the next couple of weeks, and they didn't make it to today's class, you can come on Wednesday. And I need you to be there if you're going to participate. And so we get here, and Jesus shows up, and he visits John the Baptist. And John the Baptist, believe it or not, is somebody who baptized people. Go figure, right? And he happens to be Jesus' cousin. So they're relatives, and you read that story earlier in the Gospels. But in Matthew chapter 3, we're going to pick it up in verse 13. And this is what happens at this point in Jesus' life. It says, Jesus came from Galilee, this region in North Israel. He came to John at the Jordan River to be baptized by him. And John tried to prevent him, saying, well, I need to be baptized by you, and you're coming to me? So John the Baptist understood, hey, this isn't normal to baptize the Son of God who has committed no sin and needs no repentance. But like I said, Jesus is setting an example for us to follow. And so he goes and he answers John the Baptist, and he says, well, permit it to be so now, verse 15, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. Then he allowed him. In other words, there's a purpose for it, John, so just let it happen and go ahead and do it. And in verse 16, this is what happens next. When he had been baptized, so he went under the water and John brought him up. Jesus came up immediately from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him. And he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting upon him. And suddenly a voice came from heaven saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So this incredible event happens right there in the water when Jesus is getting baptized. It says he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove. I don't know if you have any birds at your house, but there are doves in my backyard, and I think they were there from the previous owner. He had he raised them, I guess, had a little hutch built and kept them in there. Well, when he passed away, after living on the property for 40 years, he just opened the door, I guess, and they all flew around and decided to make that area their home. So there's a certain collection of them that are always around, and you get to see them descend. I get a visual on that, most weeks. I can see these doves descending in my backyard. They land on the dog's water bowl, and they try to steal the water, and then they get ran off, And so it's a really graceful thing, actually, to watch. It's, just a slow descent, kind of a fluttery thing, I don't know exactly what it looks like when the Spirit of God descends on Jesus, but it's just described in this manner. And then we get to verse 17, which I read. It says, "Suddenly a voice from heaven came, and he speaks that he's well pleased with Jesus." This is probably the most uplifting, incredible experience anybody could ever have on earth. To be baptized, and when you come out of the water, the Spirit of God descends on you, and you hear the voice of God from heaven, like an audible voice, This type of experience right here, this is the biggest thing that could ever happen in a person's life, and he says he's well pleased with him. It's the pinnacle experience that we would dream about. Sometimes we struggle as people because we have to follow the Lord by faith. And it's not with the natural eye, it's not with the natural ear that we hear him and that we see him. And so we have to be able to identify our spirit that connects with his spirit. And that's not the easiest thing to do all the time. And many people struggle with understanding, how do I get started in that? They want to see the evidence. They want to hear the sound of God. Well, in this particular case, Jesus did. And so he hears the literal voice of God. Maybe you've thought that if you could just hear the voice of God, that everything would be fine in your life. Everything would change, right? That you wouldn't have any problems anymore. You would know what to do and everything. You'd never have any adversity, and your life would be fixed, and all the problems would be solved. Well, like I said, Jesus himself is perfect, even up to this point. He's without sin. He is God in the flesh at this point still. He always was, he always is. And he goes ahead and sets this example for us, and God speaks, and it's recorded here that he hears the voice of God, and there's evidence, undeniable evidence that God is real, and he has anointed this person, and he's well pleased with him. So what happened next? That's what we need to find out. Well, we go to the very next chapter, chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4, and in verse 1, this is what happened next. That pinnacle experience, that voice of God, that incredible moment. Says, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." The very next thing that happened. Wow. That wasn't exactly where I thought this was going to go in my imagination, Now, I've read the story before, but if you read it up to that point, you're thinking, wow, Jesus is anointed by God, and he's the one, he's going to just, sail through and take over the world and make everything right and fix all the problems. And the first thing that happens after he comes up out of the water, after he sets an example for anybody to see and declares what he is about to do and who he is about to be to the people around him, he's immediately led into the wilderness and tempted by the devil. And it says, when he had fasted, verse 2 in chapter 4, when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, this great revelation here, afterward he was hungry. Some people haven't fasted 4 hours, much less 40 days. Oh, okay, all right. But look, once again, here he comes as fully God and fully man. What does that mean? It means he lived life in a body just like ours. He lived life in a body that had the same needs. He needed food to survive. He needed water to survive. He had to walk. He had to wash his clothes. He had to do things just like we do. And he did it knowing that he has the power to change anything he ever wanted. But that wasn't the purpose. Purpose was to set an example for us to follow. So he begins a public ministry, a point in time when now people are understanding, hey, this is Jesus and this is who he is. When we get baptized in water, I told some of our people ready to get baptized this morning, it's a public declaration of our faith. It's an opportunity to let people know this is who I am now, and this is who I was, and this is what God's doing in my life. Jesus had a purpose that only he could fulfill. He had to wait until the right time to declare it, and then he could begin to walk in it. And that this day was the beginning of that. And so when we step out and do that, sometimes we end up following this same pattern, and Jesus sets an example of what to do when we encounter the enemy. So, sometimes it's water baptism. Sometimes it's another kind of testimony or a victory in your life that you are attributing to God, and or a calling on your life that you're going to walk in for the Lord. And afterward, we can expect that the enemy is going to come and find us. And you know what else? In this particular case, the Lord was led to the wilderness in order to have this encounter. Everything has to be tested. It's just got to be tested if it's worth anything. I kind of ran out of time when I had this idea, last night around 1 in the morning. Sometimes I get my best ideas late, and I was just thinking over this message, and I had this thought of testing a weld. I don't know does anybody weld in here? Believe it or not, I don't weld, but I've been around it, and I know a little bit, And I was remembering in school, in shop class, that they would test the welds, and I remember watching how they would do it. They had a couple different ways. So then I just started reading about that because this picture in my mind was, how do you know if it's good? How do you know it's ready? How do you know it can handle any pressure or any adversity? The only way to know is to test it. Now, I guess if you're experienced, you can have a visual inspection. You can look it over, and there's people who can look at a weld and spot some things that are flaws, or they could tell, hey, that's done pretty well. But when you are tested, you find out if you really have what you think you have. And that's why when you're starting out, you have to qualify your welds. You have to be certified in certain types of welds, and they run them through a test. And they put some pressure on these things. And I wanted to bring some visual aids, but like I said, I just kind of was thinking this late into last night. But some of the things that are the strongest in our life, the structural things that are made of metal, are welded. And every one of those welds came from a welder who had to pass a test. And their work was tested. And so Jesus is setting an example for us. He comes and he gets baptized and he declares it's declared who he is. A voice from heaven declares who he is. And then he is proven. And he didn't need to be proven, but we needed him to be proven because we're the ones watching. He knew who he was the whole time, but he's going to set an example for us. So he gets out into the wilderness to be tested or to be proved. And the enemy, comes up with all of these things, and he hits all of these areas that are common to man. And when you read the rest of the story, and I don't have time to dig into that part real deep today, but when you read that story, you see that there are some very, very tempting things that the enemy comes with Jesus. He says, well, how about this? And how about that? And he tempts him with all the things that we love as people in the flesh. He is wanting to see, will Jesus hold up under the pressure? Will he pass the test? Will he be able to stand? And so that's kind of the enemy's job, I guess, in situations like that. He's going to be the one that applies the test to see if we'll stand. And we think, well, why does this have to happen? And then I'm going to pull out probably one of the least popular scriptures in the whole Bible, which is found in James chapter 1. And this is what it says here, right off the bat here. I think I'm in verse 2. It says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials." No, God, I don't want to take that part out of the Bible. "Knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience." Well, I don't even like either one of those things, God. I don't like testing of my faith, and I don't like patience, so why do I want that? But you know what? We all know that if you can grab a hold of patience in your life, we know that that's a blessing. We just don't like the process of getting there. You know, we don't want to wait for patience, do we? Can't I just get patience the fast way? But the Bible says that we should know that the testing of our faith produces patience. Think about Jesus. He shows up. He does everything right. He does it all at the right time, in the right way. And he starts his ministry, and he knows the end from the beginning. Like, he already knows what's happening now, and he knew it back then. And he's had to wait thousands of years. He's still waiting for his reward. I mean, wow, what an example of patience. I mean, Jesus could have changed. In fact, the enemy even tempts him and says, "Can't you just tell these stones to turn into bread? Can't you just command it to happen? You know, can't you do this? Can't you just speak a word and this will happen?" It's like, yeah, he could, but that wasn't the plan of God. Remember, he was hungry. He fasted for 40 days. The enemy was tempting him at his greatest weakness in the flesh. But James said, "Knowing the testing of your faith, it produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." So there's something there that we need if we want to become more like Jesus. If we want to become more like Christ, we cannot hit the pause button on developing patience in our life. We can't hit the pause button on testing our faith, because it's a process that produces something that we need. In the Bible, it says, "Let it have its perfect work so that you can be perfect and complete." In other words, if you don't let those processes impact your life, then you will be lacking in the end. And James says, if you allow these processes, you'll be lacking nothing. So there's an example that we got to consider that we might want to follow. Nobody likes patience, but have you ever done any cooking and you just didn't give it enough time? You know, when we first got married, I got to be honest, I could make Eggos in the toaster. And now I can make Eggos and toast. Oh, I can make pancakes. Yeah, so I've upgraded. No. Now I can at least barbecue something. Some of you guys ate my barbecue recently. You came to different events, and I've actually been able to grill a hamburger properly. It's like 50-50 now. But there was a day, I remember, we were first married. I'd never even used a barbecue before. I didn't know anything. And so we had Jill's sister over. I don't know who else, but that's the one I remember. And I barbecued up these hamburgers, and we served them. And she bites into hers, and it's just not even cooked. I mean, it's the outside. I seared the outside, and I'm like, well, that looks black. And I flipped it over, and a couple minutes later, I put it on the plate. I didn't have a clue what was going on. And she's still with us today, so you know, let patience have its perfect work. You know what I mean? Sometimes you got to figure out the environment that you're in order to get the results that you need. If anybody bakes in here, I do know how to bake things. It's because I like to eat them, so I can bake what I want. I can make a cake now, right? But if you don't cook it all the way, you know what I mean? Isn't that so disappointing? I mean, have you ever not checked and then you pull it out and then it's too late? That's so disappointing because you waited, instead of waiting 45 minutes like you were supposed to, you waited 30 minutes. So you still waited 30 minutes and now you get nothing in return. and you've wasted 30 minutes, and now you have this gooey mess that you can't even eat, when all you had to do is just let patience have its perfect work, and then you have this nice, beautiful dessert, right? Patience is good if it gets applied in the right place at the right time, it produces something good. And everyone agrees on that. That's when we don't let it happen, then we get into trouble. Now, I'm going to go over to 1 Peter if you have a Bible, and I think I have most of this on the screen, but you're more than welcome to turn or to scroll there yourself and make a note in your own Bible. But I like reading the writings of Peter in the Bible because he oftentimes has a good perspective, like it comes out in his writing very often, how short time really is, how little time we have left in this world. When I read the writings of Peter in the Bible, the books that he wrote, that's what I see often. He's reminding us, hey, knowing that we have such little time, knowing that the end of the world is near, knowing that there's a destiny for the world and for us, and there's a judgment coming from the Lord, and sin is going to be destroyed. How should you be? How should you act? How should you think? How should you treat others, right? I mean, he's constantly reminding us time is short. Well, this is what he says in 1 Peter. I'm going to be in chapter 4, and I'm going to read several verses here. So if you're following along, we're going to read them all here. In 1 Peter chapter 4, we'll start right at verse 1. This is what he says. He says, "Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind." Now remember, Christ, I'm going to pause there just for a second. Since he suffered for us in the flesh. Well, let's go right to the cross first and foremost. Since he suffered all the way unto death. That was his example. It led him throughout his life all the way to the cross. The cross is the ultimate example of what Christ has done for us. I mean, he took all of our sin, the Bible says, upon himself. That is the sin of humankind, past, present, and future. He paid a price that would be eternal. So right there is the ultimate standard, and that's something that only he could do. But when we look at the rest of his life, we say, wow, he actually suffered a lot more than that. When you watch how he was treated everywhere he went, he had people that were following him, and then he had people that were betraying him. He had people welcoming him into their home to spend the night, and he had people running him out of town and literally throwing rocks at him in an effort to kill him. He had people who trusted him and would die for him, and he had people who would lie about him and testify false testimony in order to harm him. Jesus, it's not recorded that he ever owned anything. He never owned any property. He never owned any transportation. It doesn't say that he had flocks and herds that he was managing. He didn't have a bunch of horses and chariots that he went around in. Now, I don't know if that would count as suffering, but it's certainly not living at the top of the status in the earth. He didn't have the amenities that we even have today. He didn't have climate-controlled areas. He didn't have speakers and projection devices to speak out of to the crowds. He didn't have a country that he lived in where it was safe to preach the word. We are so blessed here in America. We have all of those things. And today we're enjoying them. And so this is interesting because Jesus was able to fulfill his destiny without any of those amenities. And it took him all the way to the cross. And Peter writes, since he suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same mind. There's a lot of places you could probably go out of that verse, but what comes to mind for me is that we ought to be thinking about this life like Jesus thought about this life. With him as the example for us, knowing that he had a purpose that only he could fulfill, but along the way, he's showing us what we can do if we pay attention. We don't have to chase things in the world. We don't have to chase money. Why? Because Jesus didn't. If Jesus was the richest person on the earth, I really believe we would all be. I do, because we're his followers. And, you say, well, if you got a problem with that, I guess you got to take it up with God. Apparently that wasn't his plan. But if that was what life was about, he would have done it. And if he wanted us to live that way, then we would be living that way. If he wanted us to live anyway, he would have set an example for us, and we look at how he lived, that's how we should live. Not just in the outward, but he did it inside. This is where it goes. We'll go to the next slide here as we continue to read on in verse 1. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lusts of men. And the way we know that is because Christ didn't do it, but for the will of God. For we have spent enough, and now he's writing to us. Here we are, a couple thousand years later. Peter is writing to us. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime doing the will of the Gentiles or the unbelievers. And here's some things he lists. Isn't it funny how things never change? When we used to walk in lewdness, in lusts, in drunkenness, in revelries, in drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. When we go evangelize every week, there's a team of people that head out of here on Tuesday mornings at 10 a.m. And anybody is welcome to join us. We go in pairs, and we actually just knock on every door in basically Marysville, Olivehurst, Linda, and wherever else we want to go. And we see all of these things on display. We see all of these things on display in 2025. This entire list we see on a weekly basis just when we interact with the people in our community. We understand that people on the earth are still dealing with the same sins that everyone has always dealt with, which is a great reason to bring the gospel to them, because nobody has it figured out without God. And I'm coming to learn this every day that I serve the Lord, just as a believer. And the older I get and the more people I interact with, I just keep adding to this solid truth that nobody has it figured out without God. We see people who look on the outside like they have it all figured out. They've got whatever it is that makes their life look perfect and streamlined and, happy and wealthy and, family and all this stuff. But if you sit and talk long enough, it begins to come out. And you begin to hear, and my heart begins to break for people who are living a facade, and it's an empty place. It doesn't really matter about those things, because some people will enjoy some things and some people will enjoy other things, and it's okay to participate in all things that are not immoral. But when I go around, I see these sins that just emerge, and they snare people, and they trap you. The sins of lusts and drunkenness and parties and the idolatry that we see. Maybe if you don't go door to door, you don't understand that in America, we like to think of ourselves as a Christian nation. That's been like a label that we've heard in my generation, for the last 44 years. A Christian nation. Well, I want to remind you that Christianity is not an American religion. It's not an American religion. It has nothing to do with America as a political system. It has everything to do with Jesus Christ and his relationship with people on this planet. And that's in every country, in every tribe, in every nation. I mean, he's looking to rescue people out of these sins right here. And when I get to the end and it says abominable idolatries, historically we haven't thought about America in that. But interestingly enough, when we go door to door, I've seen more blatant idolatry than I ever could have imagined existed in this community. I just thought that people were just racing after drugs and alcohol all the time and just, partying and going here, going there, whatever, lust and all this stuff. There's a significant amount of abominable idolatries in Yuba and Sutter County, and it's not hidden. It's just I wasn't looking for it before. People are trying to fulfill their life with all kinds of different things besides Jesus. And Peter is addressing those things to us even in our day. They're all still here. So this is what he says. He says, we used to walk in those things. Verse 4, in regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation. And then they speak evil of you. So they think we're the crazy ones for wanting to live right, wanting to do right by God, wanting to follow Jesus and have integrity, wanting to treat people with love and respect, and wanting to help our neighbors. And, it's like, what is flipped upside down in our society? Well, this is just what happens. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Because that's all of our destiny. We're going to have to give an account for our lives to the Lord. For this reason, the gospel was preached also. Wow. And then we go on. I'm going to skip ahead because I'm kind of running out on time. Verse 7. This is where I like Peter. He says, but the end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be serious and watchful in your prayers. I mean, does that wake you up a little bit? Think about your prayer life. Think about the substance of your prayer life. Now, I'm not here to criticize your prayer life. We all have lists of things that we like to pray for. And it's whatever we can come up with. You know what I mean? Like, whatever hardships we're dealing with in life, whatever problems we have. I mean, the Bible says if anyone's in trouble, let him pray. So it's not wrong to pray about anything at all. We have my kids have a couple cats, all right? So this last week, one was hit by a car about a month ago. So I found it in the ditch. That's kind of, that's tragic, right? They're not in here, so I can tell a story. So we had, because the mom cat had kittens, so that was one of them. So it died. So while they were at school, I found it, buried it. They didn't have to see it. Well, then this week, just randomly in the afternoon, one of the cats that always is in a certain spot, it just disappeared, didn't come back. And then the next day, it's not there, and I'm like, oh no, here we go again. I live on this street. It's really a busy road. So I spent a couple of different days just taking an hour or so to walk around the ditches, and, I'm like, man, did I miss it? I'm like weed eating grass, expecting to find a dead animal in it. It's, not a fun thing. 3 days goes by, no cat. Now the kid, my daughter especially, really sad now. And I'm like, man, what are we going to do? Nobody likes to see their pets, die. And so we just got the family together, and I said, I was like, I know you've probably prayed about it. And she's like, I have, because she knows to do that. But I said, let's just have a family prayer really quick, and let's just ask the Lord to help us figure out what to do. Maybe give us peace if this cat's dead. It seemed like a small thing, but it's like I wanted to set an example to my kids that you can go to God with anything, just anything. Your kids are crying. Why would God not have time for you? He does. He has time. So we grouped up. I said a little prayer, 30 seconds, and like I said, just had that little discussion with the kids. It was, 7 o'clock at night. Went to bed that night. I'm not making this stuff up. The next morning, I hear my daughter wake up before anybody, and she goes out to the front door, and she opens the door, and one of the other cats was right there. And it's like, she's petting it and stuff. And she turns around and hears a meow and looks over, and there's the cat. There's the lost cat. We haven't seen it in 3 days. Not a trace of it. Just nothing. And it never leaves. It doesn't, they don't go anywhere. They're well fed. You know what I mean? To me, I brought the kids together. I said, listen, don't forget to thank the Lord for the small things. I know you got your cat back. I know, you checked something off your list, but I'm like, wait a second, it's not really about that. What it's about is the growth in your own heart, where you saw God answer a prayer, and I'd say that he did it pretty quickly. It's just, you know what I mean? So we can have lists, and we can pray for anything. But what Peter says is he says, the end of all things is at hand. Be serious and watchful in your prayers, right? Well, I don't think Jesus prayed for a lot of cats. You know what I mean? Just as an example. Now, he knew where they all were, and he could intervene at any time. But I don't think he spent a lot of time doing that because he knew that his ministry time was so short. You know, his lifespan of public ministry was only a few years, like 3.5 years. So he didn't have a lot of time, and he had to go a lot of places. He had a will to fulfill from the Lord. And Peter says, look, there are things happening in the world that are very important, like the end of all things is near. He's basically reminding us, hey, what kind of person do you want to be? What do you want to invest in the short time that you have? He says, be watchful in your prayers. He says in verse 8, have a fervent love for one another. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. I wanted my kids to know that I can believe God for things. It wasn't about the cat. It was a teaching moment of something of God that they probably won't ever forget. That will take them to the next thing in their life when it is needed that is much more important. They'll have something to grab a hold of. They'll say, my parents taught me to trust in God, to believe him when things seem impossible. And although there wasn't a lot riding on this situation, there wasn't a solution in sight. The solution wasn't visible. It was impossible in their mind, and we took it to the Lord. Peter's like, look, there's things that you need to be thinking about and you need to be praying about because time is short. Let's make sure that our heart is interested in those things. Let's make sure that our speech and our attitude toward one another is in the right place. Not complaining, not grumbling, not all those things. He's like, as each one has received a gift, minister it, be good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it with the ability that God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. That was what I wanted my kids to know. That's what I wanted them to know. I remember a testimony from Curtis May, I think it was he the one in the pool with the contact lens? He lost his contact lens in a pool swimming, and he prayed about it, and he went over to the filter, and there it was. And he pulled his contact. Do you think God cares about a contact lens? No, but what he does care about is that we know that we can bring our cares to him and that he will answer when we call on the name of the Lord. He wanted to use that as a faith-building opportunity for Curtis, just like he did in my family. So go to the next slide there, Philly, if you will. Verse 12, Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings. You know that it's not going to be easy to say that you are going to serve and follow Jesus. I'm just going to tell you that right now. That's not the easiest thing in the world. When we look at the life of Jesus, it wasn't easy for him, even though he knew what to do and he was willing to do it. He came up out of the water. The voice from heaven even said, "That's my son, I'm well pleased." And immediately he was tested. He was challenged. He was hungry. He had to go through some trials. And Peter is reminding us, just like Jesus lived, he says, don't think it's strange if you want to serve God. I'm paraphrasing that verse. That something weird is happening because you're going through some trial. Because God is trying to produce something in your life through testing and through patience that will be permanent. He's trying to produce a substance in your life that you will carry with you throughout your life and that you can then teach the next generation. That's what he's trying to do here. He says, rejoice in verse 13 to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings. You know, we probably don't have to rejoice because bad things are happening. We don't have to rejoice and say, I'm so happy these bad things are happening. We don't have to enjoy them. We don't have to lie and say, I really love suffering. Nobody loves suffering. We don't have to lie. We don't have to act like it doesn't affect us. It affects us. Peter's not saying we need to lie about it. This is what he's saying. He says, we need to rejoice to the extent that we are partaking of Christ's sufferings, knowing that whatever we're going through, because we are his, because we are declaring we are going to follow Jesus, we can trust that what he's going to produce in our life is much bigger and better than that trial that we face. We can trust he's going to get us through the trial, that we're going to come out of it with a testimony at the end, something that we can then pass on. How do you think Peter was able to write these letters? He didn't do it the first day he was saved. He didn't get his pen and paper out and say, I'm going to write something that's going to last for 2,000 years. He'd already been tested. He'd already been tried. He'd already had patience begin to work a completeness in his life. And he's trying to pass on some things to us because he knows how short time is. So I get to the end here. We get to that verse 13, which I just read the first half of it. Rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. See, Jesus, he went under the water. He came up. The Holy Spirit descended like a dove on him. A voice from heaven said, you are my son, and I am well pleased. That's the perfect example of how we can be known in this world as a child of God. Jesus modeled it right there. Let's start with God's stamp on our life. When you commit your life to Christ, the Bible says when you confess it with your mouth, when you believe it in your heart that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead and that he is your Lord, that you'll be saved. That's a moment in time when all of heaven rejoices. You may not hear an audible voice, but you may. It's not for me to decide. But there's a seal placed on your life from God. The Spirit of God, just like it descended on Jesus, it will enter your heart through faith. And you are sealed with a promise for all eternity. And you're known as a child of God. It's who you are. Your identity is different. And Peter says, if you are reproached because of that, if you're persecuted because of that, if people don't like you because of that, because you want to serve God, because you want to do right, because you want to change the way that you used to live and say yes to what God's word says and start living out of that, if people revile you and they hate you and they lie about you and they want to kill you, blessed are you. For the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Wow. Anybody want that in here? I want that. You guys stand with me. I'm gonna stop there for this morning.